Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of This Academic Life. It is Friday, July 5th. First of all, important update, I have achieved candidacy. So I passed my prospectus, and now I'm writing my dissertation, or at least trying to figure out where I'm going with my dissertation and starting to write it. So, in a new phase in academic life, and that feels kind of cool, even though I'm terrified of actually having to write a whole dissertation. Anyway, I want to make a video that I've been wanting to make since I started my channel. It's the video I've wanted to make since the beginning. Probably the reason why I started talking about emotional life and academia. And that's empathy. So for those of you who follow me on Twitter, you'll probably know that my username is @empathywarrior. And I chose that because at the time that I really started getting into Twitter a few years ago, I was doing a lot of emotional work in my life, and I was reading the works of Brené Brown. So if you don't know who Brené Brown is, she is a professor of social work at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's a New York Times best-selling author, and she's done a few really awesome TED Talks about the topics of vulnerability, shame, and empathy. Her work is really accessible. It's based on research, which I love. I do love some good data collection and, kind of an empirical process. And what's really great is I think that these have been topics that have been taboo and also in some ways really misunderstood and haven't always been able to understand how empathy and shame manifest themselves in different environments. I don't think that empathy is something that we like to talk a lot about in academia because I think we still like to see it as the ivory tower, where we conduct ourselves in very business-like ways and where we're interested in the pursuit of knowledge, and that pursuit is supposed to be very book-like, very scientific. It's data, it's analyses, and we don't really feel our way through things. Even for those of us who study emotion and trauma, and I do, so I absolutely understand that disconnect at times. And I think that we intellectualize and often create emotional distance. Sometimes that's necessary for the work, but it can also result in shutting ourselves off to other people or feeling like we're almost exploiting other people's pain so that we can just complete a research project without recognizing our relationship to that pain. And all of that spills over, of course, into academic culture, into the relationships that we have with our colleagues, with our students, with our supervisors, and with our coworkers. So what I want to do today, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, is to talk about what empathy is, some examples of what that might look like in academic culture, and why it matters so much. And I think it's really hard to explain to people why it matters in a workplace, let alone in academia. But I know, and this is becoming an increasing subject of study, workplace bullying is incredibly prevalent. Cultures of workaholics and perfectionism and competition are still really, really powerful, and that's why empathy is really important to combat that. So, and I'm reading off notes because I wanted to be somewhat prepared for talking about this. So first of all, empathy versus sympathy. So sympathy is really looking at somebody else from a distance. It's feeling sorry for them as opposed to feeling with them. It's really a position that, in my opinion, keeps us from engaging. Empathy, however, which we've commonly understood as through the metaphor of walking in someone else's shoes, really requires us, as well as the other person, obviously, to be in positions of vulnerability. It requires us to recognize that, yes, we too feel pain. We are stressed out about our work. We struggle with deadlines and procrastination and feeling overwhelmed. We understand the courage that it takes to be vulnerable enough to share that pain. And it also means that we recognize some of the ways in which our lives may have protected us from certain pains. And it makes us look at our privileges and our sources of power or powerlessness, which in a culture that still has hierarchies is really, really crucial. So, therefore, empathy is a very political concept, and it requires us to look at ethical ways to be in relationship with other people. In academia, I think it's really hard to see what empathy might look like practically, because it's not necessarily a place where you do the emotional work that we're used to seeing, say, in a counseling office or in a doctor's office or in social work. It's not necessarily that type of situation. Often, of course, what we're dealing with is feedback on our work, the bureaucracy of the institution, the inevitable thing that our personal and professional lives are, of course, intertwined when we're dealing with family life and our workloads and trying to give our time to everybody. And that doesn't matter if we're students or faculty members or staff. It affects everybody. Another really important thing to recall is that, especially for those of us who are students or faculty members, and Brené Brown points this out, most people have had a formative shame experience in the classroom. So just because things like corporal punishment might have disappeared from the classroom, you don't, as far as I know, in most places I would assume, you don't have, students being rapped on the hand with a ruler or being, hit. It doesn't mean that shaming practices aren't still alive and well. And I think we can all recall a moment where we've been made to feel or have observed others being made to feel shame in the classroom. And that might come from a teacher who makes us feel stupid, who points out our mistakes, who tells us that they can't believe that we failed a test. And it might be students who then engage in that shaming process as well. Like, you didn't work hard enough. Everyone knows that what it feels like, or what it feels like to see that kid who's called out for something. So I was really lucky in that I didn't experience a lot of that in my grade school years. And I totally acknowledge that I was protected in some ways from that. But in terms of my academic life in post-secondary, I can certainly speak to some of my experiences where I received empathy and when I did not receive empathy, when I received a shitstorm of shame. So the first few years of my academic life in post-secondary were pretty uneventful. I went to class and I didn't feel like I struggled that much, and I had really great professors. I didn't have, huge relationships, personal relationships with them. It was just kind of ordinary. At that time, however, as I got into the later years of my undergraduate degree, I was really struggling with depression and anxiety and an eating disorder, and eventually it was impacting my work to the point where one of my professors took me aside and said, "You need to go get help." Not, "You're a failure, you need to go get help," but "I see you really struggling. You could be doing amazing work, but you need to be healthy enough and well enough to do that." And so I ended up going to counseling services and starting to see somebody there to work through those things. Of course, I was initially angry because nobody likes to have to go and seek help, but it was done in a way that made me feel like I was loved and I was supported, and that this professor really had my best interests and was not doing it to punish me. Right? Shame and punishment are so linked together, and this was not a case where I was being punished. Fast forward to my master's degree. I did a one-year master's degree. It was coursework. And so in that very first fall, I had to then decide if I was applying to PhD programs for the next year. Didn't really know what else to do. Thought, I'll apply. Maybe I'll get in. And I got in. And I was baffled and terrified. Excited, of course, but terrified. And the closer that it got to having to start it in the fall of 2009, I began feeling really immense anxiety. I have anxiety naturally. I have generalized anxiety, anxiety about traveling to new places, going to new environments. It dissipates pretty quickly after I've been there, but for me it's so overwhelming that even driving to a new place can make me think for a week ahead about just how terrifying it might be. So that's kind of part of that. I also decided that I wanted to then postpone my entrance into the PhD program. So instead of starting in September of 2009, I decided to postpone it a semester and start in January of 2010. That wasn't a problem for my PhD program. They said, "That's fine, we'll see you in January, and we hope that everything's going well." But as the stress came up in that September, I started to have really bad anxiety again. I was also teaching, And I had a student who was problematic in that class, and that was also giving me a lot of anxiety. This was my first time TAing, and that was a little bit much to deal with, and I didn't quite know how to handle that situation. So I confided in my supervisor for the course, who I had taken courses with in my undergrad as well, and just saying that I was struggling, and the struggle became more and more and more. And initially she was really helpful, said, I'm here to talk, here's my home phone number, if you're struggling with this anxiety, and especially with this course, I want you to call me. And I felt, that was really wonderful, just because I needed somebody who understood exactly what that position was. I'm especially going to do a PhD. Eventually, when I was at the point where I was really struggling, she basically turned on me and started saying things like I would fail if I went to go do my PhD, that I was a terrible teacher, even though my students said nothing of the sort, and when I actually had to leave my TA-ship and go on medical leave, they emailed and said that they missed me and that I was a great TA, but I was being told that I was a terrible teacher. And I was told that I shouldn't be seen in the department other than when I had to go to class. And I was basically I was made to feel as if I was less than, as if because I was struggling with anxiety, because I was having a very human struggle, and because I was not super confident about going to do my PhD, that I should just be ostracized. And it's not something I've ever experienced before or since, and all I know is that that's a completely unempathetic response, and that's how you basically shit all over somebody with shame. Not to be crude, but that's exactly what it is. Because she told me this, I was 22 at the time, I listened to that. So I phoned up my PhD program, I think in October, and I said I had to withdraw. And they said, well, but if you can't postpone it another, to the next September, so you might have to withdraw and then apply again. And I said, fine, I just can't do it. I'm really lucky in that a very, very dear friend who is a former professor and is now one of my best friends said, please do not listen to that. And she helped me get on the phone with my PhD program and say, cancel the withdrawal, I'll be there in January, but this is the struggle, and I'm anxious, and I need to go part-time to start out with, and I need some help. I obviously ended up going to my PhD program, which I'm in now. I'm in my 4th year. And in the first semester, even though you can't technically go part-time, I ended up only taking 1 course. And that was fine. The graduate chair was amazing. The graduate secretary was amazing. My colleagues were supportive. And that really helped me to see that there are certain individuals who might embody those shaming practices. This isn't a criticism of my alma mater. That was the only person I had trouble with. It's a criticism of a particular person. And more specifically, it's a criticism of a culture that produces this type of attitude. That if someone is struggling with anxiety or depression, or maybe they're just freaked out about not knowing what a PhD program looks like, or they have trouble teaching. Not everyone, the thing is, when you're a teaching assistant, often you get thrown into a classroom for the first time, never having taught before. You don't get trained beforehand. Sometimes your training is happening on the job or at the same time. And it's really anxiety-provoking. It's terrifying. I didn't TA in my first year of my master's because I was terrified of it. And now I love teaching. But I can see how in that first semester, especially dealing with a problem student, it was hard. So, sometimes there are whole departments that are toxic, of course. Sometimes it's just one person. Sometimes it's fellow graduate students that can be really hurtful to each other. Sometimes it's faculty members that are hurtful to each other. Sometimes it's an advisor that shames a student. There are all sorts of configurations. Lacks of empathy come from a lot of places in academia. It can be, unsympathetic people who work in administration when students are trying to get documentation for illness or whatever. But what I've learned from this, 2 things. Well, no, 3 things. First is that we need to be able to talk about these things. About depression, anxiety, workplace stress. I think I read somewhere recently, and I'll look it up to link it in the bottom bar, that 54% of doctoral students have struggled with depression that is severe enough to affect their daily life. That's a huge problem. We need to talk about that, about faculty stress, about competition, the culture of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, otherwise you're a failure, and heaven forbid that you quit your PhD because of the stress, because that just proved that you couldn't hack it. Let's focus on the structural problems, not the symptom of the structure that is in a lot of ways pretty messed up. Now I want to empower people here. I don't just want to point out problems. So, we need to understand when people share their struggles with us, that whether it's a fellow student or a student that we're teaching, whether it's for me, undergraduates that I'm teaching, or faculty members who have graduate students who come to them, that's an honor. The amount of courage that it takes for people to make themselves vulnerable is huge. I've had students that have been struggling, whether it's a workplace stress or a workload stress, whether it's family issues, whether it's work-life balance. When somebody feels like they can talk to me, I need to live up to that responsibility that I have to respond in a way that isn't shaming, that isn't say, it's not my problem, I don't want to deal with it, but to respond in the interest of the student. So, of course, boundaries are really important. You need to know what the resources are on our campus. For all people, staff, faculty, students, what are the resources that we can use if we're feeling stressed? And what are the resources that we can point people to if they come to us? So know where things like Access and Diversity or the Center for Learning Disabilities, counseling centers, where those writing centers, know where those resources are. Learning reflective listening skills, the type of thing that you learn in a peer counseling program, you can take courses on it, or even just learn them online. Reflective listening, being able to hear somebody and respond in a way that doesn't say, I don't want to deal with it, but I hear what you're saying. And I may not have all the answers, but I hear you, and I'm not sitting here judging you. So I'll also put some links in for reflective listening skills. The third thing I think I would advise, and obviously I'm not a licensed psychologist or a counselor, even though I've done a lot of, I do peer counseling work and stuff like that. It's really important not to make this into some huge, bigger deal than it needs to be, to respond with really an appropriate response. It sometimes can feel so overwhelming for other people that when we respond and make it a big deal as well, it can make people feel even more overwhelmed. So just to respond with empathy, but not with, you kind of know what I mean. Another thing I would say is to follow up and ask people how people are. It's so easy to say, I don't know what to say to somebody, I don't know what to say to a student, I don't know what to say to a colleague, but if somebody, maybe just follow up and ask how they are, send an email. I had a student a couple years ago who's really struggling with taking on a big course load. And after we talked, I just followed up the next day with an email to say, hey, how are things going? How are you feeling? And it takes a quick second. And yes, it means that there's a different type of relationship that's not just, I teach you material in the classroom and then I leave and you go home. But we are human beings having an interaction because we both experience stress. And I feel like this is revolutionary work. That to combat the culture of the commodification of education, this institutional machine where we often feel like numbers, this is a way to restore the face of the human to what we do. That we're all human beings regardless of our particular positions within the university, and that struggles are universal in many ways. And it's incumbent upon us to recognize that. I think we also, I mentioned earlier that we often have shame experiences in school, but I think a lot of people can talk about that one teacher, or that one staff member, or that one fellow student who, told them that they didn't deserve to be bullied and listened to them, who sat with them while they were upset, who said, here's a resource, who just said, I see you, I hear you, I recognize you, and I'm not going to turn my back. Those moments are formative, and we can participate in that culture. And that requires being vulnerable with each other. It's not easy. The last thing that I would say is that I understand fully that not everybody has the same temperament. Not everybody wants to or should feel like they need to talk about their problems with everybody. Obviously not. Not everyone has a department where they feel comfortable or have students that they feel comfortable with. This is why knowing alternative resources are important. For me, Twitter has been an amazing resource. I think that's why I use it so much and why it's been key to my understanding of networking and community in academia. That you can talk to people and you can use an anonymous handle. You don't have to necessarily reveal your identity, but you can talk about these issues with other people. I had a really great conversation on Twitter, I think a couple of weeks ago, in which this culture of bullying and shaming was coming up regarding somebody's struggle to find a tenure track position. And I'll link the article below as well. And just you can see some of the comments with this article. It's endemic to the culture, but I think by creating connection we can really combat it. I certainly don't have some big prescription for how to go about it. I think it manifests itself in different ways. It can be, you know, at the beginning of a course saying, let's lay down some ground rules for our class so we all feel like we can speak without having to question ourselves. Let's create some rules so that we all feel safe with each other. I hope that this has been helpful. I'm always interested to hear what people's experiences are. Know that you're not alone. Many of us have experienced these moments of feeling shame and being made to feel ashamed. But ultimately it's important to realize that sometimes there are other things at work and that it's not necessarily that there's some big problem with us and who we are. So this is me signing off for this academic life for maybe a couple of weeks. And I'll talk to you in the next video. Bye everybody.